Welcome aboard, applicants. Let's get with our question number 3 from the First Year Law Students Exam, June 2014. As with all essay questions, we should begin with the call of the question, so let's begin there. Under what theory or theories, if any, might Abe bring an action for damages against Gary? Discuss. 2. Under what theory or theories, if any, might Betty bring an action for damages against Slideco? Discuss. 3. Under what theory or theories, if any, might Carl bring an action for damages against Jane? Discuss. Okay, right here we can start actually answering. Without knowing our area of law yet, we can start answering our questions, our call of the questions, by setting up a conflict pair, and that is Abe v. Gary for number 1. Number 2, Betty v. Slideco. And number 3, Carl v. Jane. Okay, making sure we put space between these. Also, we're going to probably bring this to the next page. There we go. Okay, right there. Okay, excellent. So now we've recorded that we've read our call of the question. Okay, now let's do our first read of the question in what we call movie mode to get a big picture perspective. Okay. Jane, a babysitter, took 3 6-year-old children, Abe, Betty, and Carl, to the playground. Abe ran through flower beds bordering the playground. Gary, a groundskeeper, yelled at Abe, "Hey, get out of the flower beds," and threw a rock at him. Abe ducked and the rock missed him. Betty climbed the ladder at the back of a metal slide manufactured and sold by Slideco. The surface of the slide became very hot on typical summer days. The day was a typical summer day, and the slide surface reached a temperature of 140 degrees. As she went down the slide, Betty sustained burns on her legs. Carl began to kick a soccer ball. Jane was too occupied texting on her cell phone to notice that Carl had kicked the ball into the street and was running to retrieve it. A motorist who was driving 40 miles per hour despite a posted limit of 25 miles per hour struck Carl and injured him. Okay, well, it looks to me like our area of law here is not contracts law, but it's most likely going to be tort law. So let's put down our tort law shopping list. Okay, intentional torts, negligence, miscellaneous, strict liability, products liability, vicarious liability, crossover torts, and what was this here now? Oh, defamation, and don't forget invasion of privacy, and we got our remedies. Now we can also synthesize this into our what we call is intentional torts, negligence, strict liability, products liability, other torts, and third-party issues. So let's do that as well. So I think what we'll do here is we'll cancel that out and we'll bring this up here. There we go. Perfect. Okay. Ask ourselves here, running through our next read, which is going to be our read for the issue spotting. Now, Jane, a babysitter, took 3 6-year-old children, Abe, Betty, and Carl, to the playground. Nothing here that has triggered anything in terms of intentional torts or negligence or any strict liability claims or products liability claims, because all we're getting here is just foundational facts, background facts that we're going to use later on in our analysis. Abe ran through flower beds bordering the playground. Okay, still interesting that we're gaining a lot of background facts now. Now, Gary, a groundskeeper, yelled at Abe, "Hey, get out of the flower beds," and threw a rock at him right here. Well, what does this look like to you in terms of our intentional torts? I should conclude the paragraph here. Abe ducked and the rock missed him. Now, the combined effect of this sentence here, what does this sentence tell you in terms of an intentional tort? Is it a battery? Well, no. Is it an assault? Yes, it is. So let's record that down here under our Gary v. or Abe v. Gary. Now, let's ask ourselves here when we're analyzing our paragraph here concerning assault. Number one, what is our definition for assault? Well, it's a volitional act by the defendant that intentionally causes the plaintiff to suffer what? Reasonable apprehension of receiving a harmful or offensive contact, the immediate harmful or offensive contact with their person, without consent or privilege. Now, remember though, we got to ask ourselves here, did Gary, remember Gary is a groundskeeper, okay? Did he volitionally throw this rock at Abe? In other words, was this as a result of Gary's own decision to throw a rock at Abe? Absolutely yes on that one. So that element would be satisfied. Now number two, the additional element of reasonable apprehension. Well, how do we know that Abe reasonably apprehended the fact of possibly having a harmful contact with the rock? Well, Abe ducked, and on top of that, the rock missed him. And so we know that he reasonably apprehended, plus there would have been, but for the fact that he ducked, he would have been hit by that rock. Okay. Now the one thing we don't want to run by without first talking about is intent. Did Gary intend to cause that reasonable apprehension in Abe of receiving that immediate harmful or offensive contact? Absolutely. How do we know? Well, if the expression, hey, get out of the flower beds, was not enough, we also know that he threw a rock not just inadvertently, okay, or negligently or accidentally. He threw this with a desire to cause a particular outcome. And that outcome was what? To get Abe out of the flower bed bordering the playground. Well, how do we know that? Well, he said, hey, get out of the flower beds, okay? So we know that there is indeed an intentional act by Gary here. Okay, just hang on there. Come on, sweetie. Thank you so much for your patience. Thank you so much for your patience. Okay. All right, now back at after having established intent that it was Gary that intended to throw the rock at Abe, and Abe indeed, therefore satisfying the element of intent, and that Abe indeed suffered severe emotional stress, suffered reasonable apprehension of receiving a harmful or offensive contact. That element would be satisfied by the fact that Abe ducked and the rock missed him. And now we need to combine those with a causation analysis. Do we know that but for Gary throwing the rock at Abe, Abe would not have ducked and suffered reasonable apprehension of receiving a harmful or offensive contact? Yes. And is it foreseeable that Abe would indeed suffer reasonable apprehension of receiving an immediate harmful or offensive contact? Absolutely yes. If someone throws a rock at you, absolutely, like Gary did here. Now, let's ask ourselves here: was there anything concerning consent? Did Gary have any argument that that because Abe ran through the flower beds, that this gave Gary consent to throw a rock at Abe? Absolutely not. And therefore, that argument would not work for Gary. Okay. Thus, did Abe suffer any damages as a result? General damages or special damages, or in our intentional tort sense, punitive damages. It could be argued that indeed that took place, that he suffered at least an emotional damage as a result of ducking, a combination of being yelled at, hey, get out of the flower beds with it, and having a rock thrown at him, having to duck, and the rock missing him. So we could argue that indeed there might have been a non-economic damage that resulted to young Abe here. And so do we have all the elements required to find assault against Gary? Absolutely yes. Okay, and see how we're using the facts in terms of our elements? Absolutely. Good job. Okay, now excuse me, is there anything further that Abe can bring against Gary? Doesn't look like it to me. Therefore, I would probably put a conclusion at the tail end of this and say that in fact Abe can bring a claim of assault against Gary for Gary's yelling at Abe and throwing a rock at him. Okay, so what about Betty v. Slideco? Well, let's come up here and read our facts. Betty climbed the ladder at the back of a metal slide, manufactured and sold by Slideco. Big fact here. What is it we know at this point? Well, we might be setting the stage for a products liability claim. We'll just see here. The surface of the slide became very hot. I want to make sure we draw that to our attention here. Very hot on what? Typical summer days. And that day was a typical summer day, so we want to make sure to bring that in. The slide surface reached a temperature of what? 140 degrees. Wow, that is hot. Okay, as she went down the slide, Betty sustained burns on her legs. There's our damages. So, what does this look like to you? Well, it doesn't look like there was an intentional tort. Does it look like there was a negligence? Well, yeah, but what type of negligence here? Well, since the paragraph started out with that the metal slide that rose to that 140-degree temperature, which caused Betty to sustain burns on her legs, was manufactured and sold by Slideco, it looks reasonable to me that we should be arguing products liability. So let's record that down here. And remember, in products liability, we have strict liability, warranty issues, intentional torts, and misrepresentation, fraud issues, and negligence. Now, remember, we're going to use possibly a negligence argument to begin with because we don't have an intentional tort. We don't have any facts that indicate that Slideco intended to cause the burns on Betty's legs. Therefore, it looks to me like we have a negligence starting issue. And remember, in negligence, we're dealing with duty. Well, what kind of duty here are we talking about? Because we're dealing with a reasonable what? Manufacturer, okay? But here's the thing. Is it a reasonable manufacturer? Yes, indeed. I would argue that. There we go. I just want to make sure that. But what are the issues that we're going to be talking about here? Whether or not, as a reasonable manufacturer, did Slideco owe Betty a duty? Well, what would that be based upon? Well, that's due to the privity versus foreseeable user argument. Okay, the privity comes from what? This would be Winterbottom versus Wright, and foreseeable user would be McPherson versus Buick. Okay, and so this one here is the one that replaced the Winterbottom versus Wright argument, and the foreseeable user, the McPherson versus Buick. That was what we should be looking at. So I'm gonna highlight this. So was Betty a foreseeable user? Yeah, she was a kid enjoying the playground and sliding on the slide. She climbed the ladder on the back of a slide, and she was technically a foreseeable kid playing on the playground, sliding on that metal slide manufactured and sold by Slideco. foreseeable user? Absolutely. Now that we know that there's a duty owed by Slideco to Betty, did Slideco breach that duty? Remember, we're going to be arguing at this point a defective product. Remember, the product can be defective for three reasons, okay? Manufacturing defect, design defect, and inadequate warning. Well, looks to me like we have a design defect because it's not just one aspect about the ladder that made it defective. Like, in other words, this wasn't just a particular manufacturing defect in that it was something that came off of a very safe slide that would not respond to a typical summer day's sun with 140 degree temperature, or reaching 140 surface reaching 140 degree temperature. No, this is a design that was built, that when Slideco built and manufactured and sold the slide, it had this design within it. So I would argue that we have a design defect here, but I would also argue that we could raise the manufacturing defect, but it would easily be dismissed. So we're going to look at the design defect, but remember our test to establish whether or not there's been a breach of the duty that was owed to Slideco by, that was owed to Betty by Slideco. We're going to look at the reasonable consumer test and the feasible alternative design test, which is technically a risk versus utility argument, okay? And what was there available at the time? Well, a safer feasible alternative design to the slide. Well, I would say it is very possible, but it doesn't actually say here. But would a reasonable consumer expect a consumer, in other words, a foreseeable user of the slide, expect the slide to become very hot on typical summer days, so much so that it reached a degree of 140 degrees, and thus anybody that would slide down the slide would sustain burns on their legs? And that's what we're asking ourselves here. I don't think so. Therefore, this would breach the duty that was owed to Betty by Slideco. Now, maybe they could have also made the slide safer by providing the slide with shade on the typical summer days that would cause it to become very hot. That is a possible feasible alternative design argument. And we also could argue that maybe they could have made the slide to not react to sunlight so much as it does. 140 degrees is very hot. And so we could argue those two arguments in our design defect, and also too, the inadequate warning could have been placed there that during typical summer days this might not be a slide that a foreseeable user of the playground would use or should use because of it reaching 140 degrees. So that's a possible argument as well. But the best one for establishing defective product would be design defect. So there was a breach of duty here. Now, want to make sure to follow all this with actual cause, but for them not designing but for Slideco not designing the surface of the slide or the slide in general so that it didn't respond in a very hot manner. Yeah, exactly, the warning. Exactly. That's right. They should have provided a better warning without one down, and that warning should have been warning defect. Exactly, inadequate warning defect. Good job. Good job. Absolutely. Or let's do warning defect. There we go. Was it an inadequate warning? I would say yes on that one. There's enough facts to establish that. There could have been a clearly visible sign that said that during typical summer days that the temperature of the slide may become very hot, and therefore it's not advisable that children should use a slide during those typical summer days. But it's any kind of warning that would have given Betty a heads up that this slide, when typical summer day sun hits it, it heats up to 104 degrees, would have definitely been warranted here, or actually would have definitely been helpful here. Now, actual cause, but for this particular design or warning defect, Betty would not have suffered the burns on her legs as she slid down the slide surface during that typical summer day, of course. Now, I want to make sure to put that's our but for test. Okay, and then proximate cause. Is it foreseeable that the slide on a typical summer day might become very hot? It's possible, because why? It's a metal slide, okay? But here's what the counter argument on that could very well be, that this typical summer day was such a hot summer day that. But here's the thing, though. Typical summer day, I don't know. It's kind of hard that it was an act of God, in a sense, that the typical summer day's sun was a result of some kind of unforeseen, superseding, intervening event that would break the chain of causation. But that is not seen here, because we have the word typical summer day being used. It's not an unusual summer day, it's a typical summer day. Therefore, and it was a metal slide, so therefore it would be foreseeable. But the argument of an intervening event breaking the causal chain would not be present here. Although we would raise it. Okay. And we're going to put in damages now. And what were the damages? The actual damages of the burns on her legs. Yeah, no shield on. Exactly. Very good. That's exactly right. That's exactly. There was no shield on the top of the slide. The damages were the burns to the back of her legs. And make sure that we talk about actual damages, general damages, which would be the those that would naturally flow from the actual damage, which would be things like pain and suffering, loss of the ability to enjoy life. And down here under special damages, this would be medical expenses, out-of-pocket expenses that her mom and dad would have to pay for her to for her burnt legs to be healed. Okay, so that's how we're going to get damages. But remember, this isn't where we're done yet. We're going to make sure to throw in our defenses here. What would be our defenses in this instance? We're going to look at contributory negligence. Let's ask ourselves here, under contributory negligence, would a 6-year-old understand that on a typical summer day, the slide surface, the metal slide surface, would reach a temperature of 140 degrees? I don't think so. And therefore, she could. It is easily overcome. The defense that she contributed to her own harm is easily overcome. Now, the other thing about this is we could also argue what other defense as well. Oh, yeah, probably, yeah, exactly. The last clear chance. Maybe that could it be said that had Slideco made the slide not react such as it did to become very hot on a typical summer day, that it wouldn't have reached 140 degrees, and that they had the last clear chance to avoid this in how they designed the slide? It's possible. It's a possible argument. Now, what about comparative negligence? This would be the argument that Slideco would say that if indeed it is found by the court that the court apportioned any kind of fault on behalf of Betty for her sliding down the ladder on the typical summer day, that she contributed to her own harm, or she in any way was at fault for her own injuries, that apportioned degree of fault would reduce her recovery. That would be Slideco's defense there. Now, the other thing about this, though, is the very last argument we're going to have is assumption of the risk. We're going to ask ourselves here, could the 6-year-old Betty assume the risk or appreciate the risk that sliding down a metal slide on a typical summer day would cause her, number one, would become very hot, and therefore if she slid down, she would assume the risk of causing burns on her legs. I don't see that. So therefore, I think this defense would fail. Now, after going through this isn't where we end. We actually are going through. Now we're going to go into our strict liability. In torts. Okay. And this is what we're going to ask ourselves here. Because are we dealing with a manufacturer, or a proper party in that we're dealing with a manufacturer? Yes. Now, did they place? Yes, because what did it say here in our facts? Number one, this slide was manufactured and sold by Slideco. Now, did Slideco put this product in the stream of commerce? Absolutely. And it's because it says that they not only manufactured it, but that they sold it. They sold the slide. Okay. Now, was the product in defective? Was it a defective product when it left the manufacturing facility of Slideco? It is arguable through the design defect and possible warning defect that when it left their manufacturing facility, that indeed it was defective, and therefore they would be liable for any harm caused by the defective product to them. That not only that the product is not just defective, but it's unreasonably defective, and therefore it's unreasonably harmful in its operation. In other words, providing children a place to slide down in terms of a slide. Now, so we got to make sure we bring up actual cause though too, which is we're going to borrow from our argument up here underneath our negligence discussion, and then we're going to talk about. I want to make sure bring this over here. There we go. Perfect. Let's see. Let me bring this over here. Perfect. There we go. Right there. Excellent. Okay. Now, actual cause. We're gonna use our but-for test, and then proximate cause. This is where we're going to borrow our foreseeability argument and intervening event argument. And then we're going to talk about damages, borrow that from above as well, and then the defenses. Now we're going to ask ourselves here, did the main defense here we're going to argue, and we're going to bring in comparative negligence. We're going to which is borrowing from our argument above. I'm going to ask ourselves here, unforeseen plaintiff misuse. The argument that the manner in which Betty used the slide coming down on the slide, that it says here that as she went down the slide, Betty sustained burns on her legs. The manner in which she went down, what does it do? Facts indicate that she misused the slide in any manner? Absolutely not. So that defense would fail. And then we want to argue again, assumption of the risk. And then we want to argue an additional fact that I think could be brought up, and that's implied warranty of merchantability. And this is something too I think that we should strive to put in as much of our of our issues in terms of product liability as we can, squeeze it in terms of time management. The implied warranty of merchantability, we're looking at ordinary ordinary operation. Exactly. So in other words, we're going. This isn't an express warranty, so it's implied warranty, and this isn't dealing with fitness for a particular purpose, but merchantability. Did the slide operate in its ordinary in its normal operation for its ordinary purpose? Well, in a sense here, it provided a slide. So yes, in that instance, but did it breach that particular implied warranty of merchantability? Yeah. Why? Because it became so hot on typical summer days, and it's those typical summer days that foreseeable users like Betty are likely to play on the playground and thus slide on that metal slide, and therefore it didn't operate ordinarily. Okay, and that's what I'm trying to get across here. In other words, it breached that implied warranty of merchantability even in not being merchantable in terms of its ordinary purpose. Well, its ordinary purpose is to provide a slide, but that sliding experience on typical summer days, of which the day that Betty used this slide was, it would become 140 degrees is not something a reasonable consumer or reasonable user of the slide like Betty would expect a slide experience, and as a result of that, yeah, slides are not unreasonably supposed to, yeah, exactly, supposed to injure slider. Exactly. They're not, the slides are not, their ordinary purpose is not to cause those that use the slide to suffer burns on their legs on typical summer days as a result of becoming very hot, okay, and reaching a 140 degree temperature. So yeah, I would say that indeed the product here, the slide, breached its implied warranty of merchantability, its ordinary purpose for providing a safe sliding experience. So that's what I would argue on that. And then now, after that, we're going to put in our conclusion. I think going through here to see if anything left in our fact pattern. I don't see anything now. Nope, I think we're good on that. So we'll conclude on this one. Now, when we come down to Carl v. Jane, let's slide up to our fact pattern. Now, Carl began to kick a soccer ball. Jane was too occupied texting on her cell phone to notice that Carl had kicked the ball into the street. Now, Carl began to kick a soccer ball. Well, right here we know that Jane should have been paying attention to Carl kicking a soccer ball, because why? Jane's the babysitter, and she was in charge of 3 children, Abe, Betty, and Carl being one of them, with babysitter during their playground experience. Now, Jane was too occupied. What? Texting. Okay, so to notice that Carl had kicked the ball into the street and was running to retrieve it. A motorist who was driving 40 miles per hour despite a posted speed limit of 25 miles per hour struck and injured Carl. So let's walk right through this looks to me like an ordinary negligence situation. So let's walk right through that right now. Okay, so negligence. Duty. Now, remember, it's not, remember who is driving 40 miles per hour despite a posted speed limit. It's a motorist, not Jane. Jane is the person who is babysitting Carl on the playground. So as a reasonable babysitter, she owes Carl a duty. What? To act as a reasonable, prudent person would act in the same or similar circumstances. Now, here's the thing too. This would be for the aspect concerning the general duty. I think we could even argue a special duty here too, because under a omission. Why? How do we argue this? That because she was the one in charge of Carl's care. Okay, and therefore she had a duty to act. Okay, and she didn't. Well, how do we know? Because it's set up here that she was too preoccupied texting on her cell phone. Could Jane use that high speed? Yeah, exactly right. That's what we're going to get to. Exactly correct. Now, down here we got breach of duty. Now remember, this is where we're gonna put in our learn in hand formula, which B less than P times L. Did Jane act unreasonable? Absolutely. How do we know? Up here it says that instead of paying attention to Carl kicking that soccer ball, she was too occupied on her cell phone to notice that. And on top of that, she was so preoccupied with that cell phone that she didn't even notice that Carl had kicked the ball into the street, and that Carl was running to retrieve it in the street. Okay, so this is pretty important that a playground babysitter should be keeping care of young 6-year-old Carl kicking a soccer ball, and therefore she acted completely unreasonable. Here's what she could have done. She could have maybe muted her texting, or the later texting for a later time, and paid attention to Carl. She could have maybe I don't know, maybe done something more reasonable in terms of not being so occupied on her cell phone to notice that Carl had kicked the ball into the street and was running to retrieve it. In other words, I would say that instead of doing that, she had a burden to have acted differently, in that she could have turned off her cell phone texting function and paid attention to Carl. Okay. Oh yes, and exactly correct. She knew the street was there. Absolutely. Okay. And therefore, that Carl ball, if he were kicking a soccer ball, which he was, or kicking a ball, yeah, the street's plus exactly. So actual cause. Now but for her being so occupied with the texting on the cell phone, Carl would not have been able to kick his ball, or he would not have been able to kick his ball into the street and run after it and been struck by the motorist, injuring Carl. So yes, indeed, there is a but for test here. I would also argue that she could argue that we have a substantial factor, but it's because of the speeding motorist, but it's very, very small argument. I'm going to put a question mark there. She could have went and got the ball. Exactly correct. Proximate cause. Foreseeability, exactly like you pointed out, that the streets, that the fact that the playground was situated in such that there was a street made it foreseeable that if Carl were to kick that ball that he was kicking into the street, that he, as a 6-year-old, would run after the ball and go into the street and possibly be hit by a car like he was by the speeding motorist. And now here's the thing, the intervening event. What is it that Jane would argue that concerning the speeding motorist? Does the speeding motorist break the chain of causation? In that it was a unforeseen, superseding, intervening event. Well, none of that actually is present here. It is foreseeable that a motorist or she could stand between the street and the kids. Exactly. That's another way of looking at our breach of duty argument, the things that she could have done. Exactly correct. Rather than paying attention to the texting on her cell phone, rather, and being preoccupied with that. Okay. Now, proximate cause foreseeability, we already proved that. Now, is there any intervening events that would break the chain of causation? Exactly. I would put that in. Yeah, I would. Absolutely. Because that is what she could have done instead. And two things we could point out. Maybe turned off the function of her phone for texting during that period that she's taking care of 3 6-year-old children. Two, put herself between Carl and the street, so that Carl, even if he were to hit his ball and kick his ball, that ball wouldn't end up in the street and him retrieving it and possibly getting hit. Yeah, exactly. And now here's the thing, the intervening event concerning the speeding motorist. Is that unforeseen? Well, is that so? I should say this. Is that so unforeseen that it is a superseding intervening event that would break the chain of causation? Well, I don't think so here. She might argue that, but it's not a very solid argument, because I could say this, that it's not something that, even though she might argue that it's a maybe possibly third-party criminality, the thing about it is, had she put herself between, like pointed out, had she put herself between Carl and the street, the whole event itself would not have taken place. So I think the fact is this event, the speeding motorist event of going 40 in a 25-mile-an-hour zone, that doesn't rise to the level of unforeseen, superseding, intervening that would break the causal chain. So I don't see that her argument of trying to find that causal chain being broken is I think is very weak and ineffective. So now looking here for proximate cause, we're going to establish now after this, did Carl suffer damages? Well, let's ask ourselves here, was there actual damages? Were there general damages? And were there special damages? And that, yes, actual damages in what form? Well, right here, he was struck and Carl was injured as a result of the speeding motorist hitting him. Now, in terms of the general damages, would Carl have suffered pain and suffering and loss of the ability to enjoy life as a result of that? Possibly. Now, would he have also, in a special damages sense, would his parents have to pay medical expenses for him to be healed as a result of that injury? Yes. Would they also have to provide out-of-pocket expenses as a result of that injury? Absolutely. Okay, so we could argue all three of those. I think we have a solid claim on that. Now, after that, any defenses? We're going to say contributory negligence. Now, the argument that Jane might argue is that Carl contributed to his own harm by what? Running into the street to retrieve the ball. But here's the thing. Would a 6-year-old have knowledge that if they retrieve the ball from the street, that a motorist traveling 40 miles an hour, 15 over the posted 25-mile-an-hour sign, would strike him and injure him? No. So I don't think she would even be able to argue contributory negligence here. And then now the last clear chance argument would come in. Now this is what we're going to say is that a response by Carl's or the response that Carl could say that Jane, you had the last clear chance to avoid the situation in the first place by not being too occupied texting on your cell phone, standing between Carl, and the road, and paying more attention to what you're doing as a playground babysitter of six 3-year-old children. Okay, so yes, the argument could be raised that, or the argument of the last clear chance would be a viable argument for for Carl here. Yeah, she had the last clear chance, absolutely. And then now comparative negligence, well, like we have above in under Betty, we could say that that under a comparative negligence argument, that if Carl is found to be at fault for running in the road, that then Jane would argue that his recovery should be reduced by that court-apportioned degree of fault. And now we're going to close our defenses with assumption of the risk. And assumption of the risk, we're going to ask ourselves again, does a 6-year-old have the ability to appreciate the dangers of running into a road, number one, to retrieve a ball, and possibly being hit by a car, which is the assumption, assuming the risk regardless of the outcome? Absolutely not. Exactly correct. So I don't think that defense for Jane would work either. So make sure we throw in a conclusion here. I think we can wrap this up. So let's see, make sure we got a conclusion above. Yep, looks great. I think we did a fantastic job. This is definitely a very interesting question. Very racehorse in the issues, but it's doable. And in the approach and strategy, essay strategy and tactics that we're employing, I think we not only can achieve it, but we can achieve it to excellence. Okay, now thank you so much for tuning in to this channel, and I hope you had a great time and a fun time at that. I want to put a shout out to Chess Cruncher TV. Keep chess crunching, Chess Cruncher. I want to put also a shout out to my Amazon Kindle book, or for my Amazon Kindle book, Battling the Big Bad Baby Bar, Essay Basics. And I want to thank you again for a wonderful time together, learning, like again, stretching our wings, practicing our essay tactics and strategies. And this being New Year's Eve, I wanted to say congratulations on everything accomplished during 2020, and greetings to 2021. Okay, thank you so much, and God bless.